Today we will consider the question of the appearance of intelligent life on Earth from an unusual point of view, whether it is possible for intelligent life, not in the form of the human species Homo sapiens, but in the form of mermaids, dwarves, centaurs, trolls, etc., from a scientific point of view. Although this topic seems like a fairy tale, there is fresh news in this area. For example, in 2020, 2 independent studies were conducted on the same topic. It was confirmed that in Central America, broad-nosed monkeys tend to come down to ground in the islands. There are such broad-nosed monkeys, capuchins, everyone has seen them in the movie Pirates of the Caribbean. There was such a cool monkey running around with a gold coin. These very capuchins live in trees because they are afraid of predators, ocelots, jaguars, and others. But on the islands off the coast of Panama, where there are no such predators, the capuchins come down quite actively and are at ease both day and night, and at all hours of the day they are high up there, because no one is eating them. But in the jungle on the mainland, where there are predators, capuchins behave very cautiously and do not set foot on the ground. At night they hide. During the day they come out only at a certain time, when the likelihood of attack by predators is minimal. And the second news, though similar, but this time about ancient times, is that there were such fossil monkeys Parolata in Cuba. They were also found on other Caribbean islands. And judging by the skeletons of these apes, they had a more terrestrial life than the other broad-nosed apes. And these island primates increased markedly in size, to about 20 kilograms, which is a lot for South American monkeys, and became more and more terrestrial, because there were no terrestrial predators on the islands. But, however, at a later time, Cuba, Jamaica, Haiti, and other Caribbean islands were inhabited by the ancestors of modern Indians, and there the monkeys came to an end. It is still unclear whether these apes survived until the arrival of the Europeans, because they disappeared somewhere around that time. So, we can see that evolution sometimes does move towards humans. The other thing is that evolution is a process, it's a survival statistic, not a woman with a cudgel. And on the other hand, natural selection is also not a man with a rake, shoveling those who are needed to one side, and the rest to the other. Evolution is simply statistics, the mathematics of survival. There is no universal law by which anyone is obliged to turn into a human being to become us. And even more possibilities exist, because the history of life on Earth is extremely rich. And over the 4 billion years of life on the planet, a wide variety of forms have arisen, many of which have had a pretty good chance of becoming something intelligent. And one of the most important elements of our sanity is our working hand. And in general, biologically speaking, humanity is defined by 3.5 attributes. The half is small fangs, although this is the most important trait. The first is uprightness, the second is a laboring hand and a developed brain. So, our laboring hand with fingers, one opposed to the others, is one of our most important elements. By the way, dragon lizards have the little finger opposed to the other fingers. It would be cool if we also opposed not the thumb, but the little finger. And of course, labor didn't make a man out of a monkey, but it completed a man out of a monkey. It made Homo sapiens out of Australopithecus. Yes, it really did. And at the same time, the brain co-evolved. But this does not exclude the fact that it could have been different. On the basis of a crab, a lizard, or anything else, there could have been completely different variations. In crustaceans, for example, there is such a variety of limbs that anything could have appeared. They could have had multiple pairs of hands, why not? With this pair of hands, for example, we would cook food, and with those hands we would write down clever thoughts, and with a third pair of hands we would comb out fleas. That is, we get more variety in the functions of the hands, and therefore more brain pumping. And then maybe other parts of the brain would emerge, solving completely new tasks and capable of accomplishments that we can't even think about, because we simply don't have those parts of the brain. It doesn't even occur to us that it could, in principle, be done. Like, for example, it doesn't occur to a chimpanzee to fly to the moon because she's a chimpanzee. It can't count to 100 because it doesn't have the concept of counting to 100. She can still be taught to count to 3, or to a maximum of 5, but no more. Division and multiplication are not available to her. Maybe, on the basis of crustaceans, other variants with other limbs would arise, which would surpass us radically. So, the hand is our everything, but no need to worry. If we dive into the distant past, for example, back in the Paleozoic, we see that cephalopods mollusks appear. And these very mollusks are pretty good candidates for the development of intelligence. We have all read Herbert Wells and know that aliens with long tentacles are very intelligent. Huddling in tin cans, they fly from Mars to us. Why from Mars? We ourselves, in our own seas, had cephalopod mollusks, which have reached a good level of development. They have quite decent ganglia, which have properties almost like our brains. For example, modern octopuses, as the most intelligent, can get angry, they can swear, they can joke, they can hate, they can play, they can engage in constructive activities. There's a good example where there was an octopus in one oceanarium, and when some employee of that oceanarium did something bad to that octopus, then after that, when that employee would go to the aquarium, the octopus would stick out and siphon water at him. That is, he remembered him and had bad feelings about him. He had done me wrong, and I'm going to pay him back. And it's just an octopus, an invertebrate animal. They can build, well, not structures, but they can put two rocks, one on top of the other, and make a cave in which the octopus will sit. They can represent themselves as crabs, sea snakes, some predatory fish by pulling out, changing color, growing some bumps on the skin. And octopuses are quite intelligent. So, in principle, they could become intelligent like us. But octopuses had a few problems. First of all, they lost their shells pretty quickly. There were cephalopods with a shell, and there are still nautiluses today. But it's an outer shell, and it's very heavy anyway. Modern octopuses and cuttlefish have developed an inner shell in the form of such a plate, but it's still not our spine and not our skeleton. Therefore, to go on land with such a weak skeleton is very problematic. The octopus on land sprawls, spreads out, and cannot lift itself. In principle, this problem is solvable. Our ancestors solved it. Our ancestors were once invertebrates, too. Then they grew a cord, then a spine, arms and legs, and all that stuff. It would seem that octopuses have an advantage because they have 8 limbs. For example, make 4 support and 2 will be working, and you can move forward. For example, a squid has 2 catching limbs in front. So, it's already a step forward compared to us. It takes less readaptation and less time to do it. But there's another problem. Cephalopods have no learning. Learning in the sense of parents teaching their offspring. I mean, every octopus no doubt learns in its life, and it can learn a lot because it's so smart. But they usually die before their offspring hatch. Octopuses are predators, they have reflexes. The mother octopus hangs her eggs in a cave, protects, preserves, but starves and dies herself. Then the octopuses hatch. If they hatch while the mother is still alive, she will start eating them herself because she is a predator with primitive reflexes. And this, in principle, is also solvable. Our ancestors overcame this too. But our ancestors were never such super predators, they were filtrators. So, they did not have this problem in full force. And the octopus has this situation. Well, the biggest challenge is that octopuses too quickly became ideal for their habitat. And already at the end of the Cambrian period, they had reached almost their modern state and they were fine. They live in a sea that doesn't change in principle. There's a sandy bottom, there's always some small, mobile food that you can catch with your beak, choke, and munch on. And that's where their evolution has stopped. But that doesn't rule out the possibility that something else might evolve from them in the future. Later on, other creatures, including terrestrial arthropods, appeared. Spiders, part crustaceans, and insects. And they have their own remarkable attributes. They have 6 or 8 limbs. They can be very intelligent. For example, ants build anthills, termites build termite mounds, bees build bee mounds, wasps build wasp mounds. And they can think, at least it looks like a thought process. Insects have mushroom-shaped bodies on their head ganglia for this purpose. These are the kind of bulges that act as our brain gyres for insects. They really look like mushrooms. They are the surface of an enlarged area so that more nerve cells, neurons, are supplied with oxygen, nutrients, and work better. But insects, with all these mushroom bodies, have a lot of limitations. The biggest problem with insects is that they can't get big. For example, they have an outer exoskeleton, a chitinous shell, which is too heavy. If we increase the beetle to the size of a rhinoceros without losing the strength of this chitinous shell, because it has to grow even thicker, it will weigh incredible tons of kilograms and the beetle simply will not be able to move. Moreover, this too rigid shell must somehow be separated during molting. They have molting, they can't grow continuously. And you have to be able to get out of the shell, you have to harden the new shell, you have to make sure the ants don't come running in and eat you at that moment. That's a lot of problems. That's why they don't get big. They also have an open circulatory system. That is, the heart is such a bubble, which is bubbling, open on all sides, and just mixes the internal environment, the hemolymph. But it doesn't get oxygen, blood, and nutrients where they need to go, to a specific place. For example, when we talk, when we try to think about what to say, we have blood flowing intensely to the brain. But it doesn't go to the left heel additionally, because we don't need it there now. And the insect either activates everything or nothing, because there is only one cavity and the fluid in it is evenly mixed. And there's a problem with breathing. Although different arthropods do it a little differently, insects specifically have a tracheal breathing system. That is, there are tubes that run through the whole body, branching, through which the gas simply diffuses by itself. These tubes, they permeate all organs, including the brain. It turns out that there is literally wind walking in the head. But if we increase such a creature, then this diffusion, this passive movement of air will no longer be enough to bring oxygen to the distant parts of the body. So an insect up to 30 centimeters, 12 inches, long may arise, but no more. In any case, it will be a thin and long thing, but it will not be possible to build up more volume, and if there is not much body volume, then the brain will not be big and the intelligence will not develop. All these problems are solvable in principle because our ancestors had similar problems. But insects are stuck in evolution and don't want to evolve further. They are fine as they are. In case anyone doesn't know, we live on a planet of insects. There may be more ants in a city or even a single field than the entire human population. So insects have a good life. In their own way, though, insects have evolved greatly in the past. They have had all kinds of forms, with complete and incomplete transformation, social and otherwise. But in general, insects have too many limitations stretching back from past times. But there are other candidates for being intelligent. Fish, for example. Fish at some point came to land, eventually became beast-like lizards and mammals, and then us. And there were other kinds of fish that could have come out on land and become something more, but they didn't. For example, bivalves, which by the way still live in South America, Africa, and Australia, also went on land. But they adapted too well to drying out on land. For example, Protopterus can bury itself in the ground, curl up, a slimy cocoon appears around it, and can lie for 3 or 4 years in this sand. It feels great, it has lungs, it breathes air and does not worry about anything. Sooner or later it will rain, it will come out of the cocoon and become a big fish again. But it is too good an adaptation to dry out. And it doesn't need to come out on dry land permanently. It lives wonderfully in this transitional natural environment, with water and dry land all around, and it has no competitors. It is the most successful there and has been living there since the Paleozoic era for hundreds of millions of years. Or take, for example, the ancient Keystepper fish Coelacanthus. Now there are still 2 species of modern Latimeria fish, one lives near the Comoros, the other near Sulawesi. These Coelacanthus keystepers were very similar to our Rhapidisca ancestors. But our Rhapidisca ancestors lived on the seashore and eventually came ashore, while the Coelacanthus went deep into the sea and became deep water. And modern Latimeria walks on the bottom on all fours, but only in the depths of the sea, and it no longer wants to go on land. And in the depths of the ocean, conditions have not changed for a long time, so for about 400 million years Latimeria remains the same and has not changed in any way. There were other fish, of course. Acanthodii were absolutely marvelous creatures, small, herring-like fish that had additional paired fins. Our ancestors had pectoral fins, which are now our arms, and pelvic fins, which are now our legs. And Acanthodii had up to 7 pairs of fins, pelvic fins, pectoral fins, and up to 5 pairs of additional fins in between. Theoretically, from such Acanthodii, if they had come out on land, centaurs could have emerged. That is, when we have several spare pairs, some of them may reduce and some of them become supporting pairs, and we don't have to go the long way of climbing up trees, coming down from trees, developing vertical climbing, primitive uprightness, advanced uprightness, releasing arms, something that took us hundreds of millions of years to do. And Acanthodii, let's say, come out on land, they have 4 fins, at least, supporting fins, and the anterior fins are already free. There can also be 6 supporting fins, and the front fins can be used to make arms. We ended up having them that way from the pectoral fins, but in this case it may have taken a few steps less in evolution. And already at the end of the Paleozoic they could have become labile. Moreover, if the body is horizontal, it is possible to build up the brain faster. It is one thing, when the head is on an upright spine, you still have to be able to balance it. It is always some kind of problem, such as spinal hernias, umbilical hernia, scoliosis, uterine prolapse, and other horrors of the vertical spine. But here the spine is horizontal, it's still there, and everything's fine. We grow a head, put it on our back, and we can grow as much brain as we want. In the Paleozoic, a transitional environment, land plants and insects appear, so you can catch these insects, pick them out of some cracks with these fins, and develop labor activity to the full. And already at the end of the Paleozoic there could have been intelligent creatures like us, purely hypothetically. But in fact, the entire Mesozoic, the entire Cenozoic passed, and only now did intelligent humans emerge. Acanthodii had one problem. They didn't live on the banks of seas and rivers. They lived in the upper, lighter strata of water and in the ocean. That is, they were such lovers of hovering in the light world, in the water column, they had such a streamlined, elongated shape for comfortable swimming, and they had no need to go on land. They swam there comfortably. Eventually some of them became bony fish, and some of them went extinct in the end. So it's a different habitat. And there was such a chance, such an opportunity. At a later stage, when our ancestors came ashore, all kinds of variants were realized. The first ancestors of stegocephals, all those Acanthostegas, Ichthyostegas, and other Tulipetan evolved different numbers of fingers and toes. That is, we have the 5-toed version, but the 7-toed version actually won out. And there were 8-toed and 6-toed versions. For example, Tulipetan, which was found in Russia in the city of Tula, was 6-toed, and both hands and feet were 6-toed. And actually we are 7-toed. Our pre-first toe and post-fifth toe appear embryonically and immediately disappear. We don't really need them. The 5 fingers, on the other hand, are preserved. By the way, we humans are very primitive. For example, the horse has only 1 finger, it rides actually on 1 finger, the ostrich has 2 fingers, both on the hand and on the foot, and it is more progressive than we are. So, the changes from some stegocephalus to woodpecker and from stegocephalus to us are very different. The woodpecker is more progressive, it has fewer toes. And we have almost the original version preserved. But there could have been other variants preserved that had other limbs. In the form of, say, some kind of tentacles, like Protopterus. Or in the form of some side extensions, and then there would be a multi-fingered. And not, as we have, when the hand is branched at the end, but when the fingers would be on each side of the limb. Some double-breathing fish have fins formed this way, and some fossil fish did. But later, when they became reptiles, first amphibians, then reptiles, there were also several variants. For example, there were Therocephalia and there was Cynodontia. And so Cynodontia are our ancestors, and Therocephalia were also very similar. They were such small creatures, omnivorous, with a body raised on more or less elongated legs, not yet as in mammals, but already visible, and maybe they have already been able to move to live birth, although doubtful, but possible. And at least it is certain that they were covered with wool. But in the end, Cynodontia won and Therocephalia lost. And that's where the competition was, in the formation of the secondary palate. We have the oral cavity on its own and the nasal cavity on its own. And Cynodontia, our ancestors, went so far as to have a secondary palate, septum, between their nasal and oral cavities, which allows them to develop a powerful sense of smell. And food doesn't interfere with that in any way. And the posterior nasal openings, that is, there are 2 nostrils in the front and 2 openings in the back going out into the nasopharynx, they kept shifting back and reached our condition. And Therocephalia had a similar skull condition, slightly different. They never formed a normal secondary palate. So, they had to either eat very small prey, in which case they would not have become large, in fact, they never did, or they had to switch to herbivory and chew incessantly. Some did, and there are many herbivores among them, but then you cannot get your brains pumped. Or they must have had a weak sense of smell. By the way, in no small part, our terminal brain is the development of our sense of smell. In fact, the front part of the brain is all olfactory structures. And then, already in the distant future, compared to these beast-like lizards, the sense of smell has decreased back, but the reserves of the brain have been engaged, and now we think with this place. And Therocephalia didn't really develop their sense of smell from the beginning and ended up losing out in the Permian and Triassic periods. In the Mesozoic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods, and in the late Triassic as well, a huge number of lineages of Molcopitans arose that could also come to reason in their own way. For example, Multituberculata, which developed the perfect dental system that brought them to their grave. When rodents and primates came along and became serious competitors, Multituberculata disappeared. Also, the marsupials had a good head start for the future. There were many different variations, and there are plenty even now. But they have an absolutely disgusting system of live birth because they actually have an embryo, and it can't become something more, and our ancestors developed a placenta in which the mother's immune response is suppressed, incidentally, thanks to the viral genes that we borrowed from viruses, and as a result, the mother does not reject the fetus, it has the ability to grow larger and become something more substantial. And at a later time, at the level of already primates, various alternative branches also emerged and very different creatures could become the bearers of intelligence. Gigantopithecus, which reached gigantic sizes and could potentially have a big brain, could become such huge do-gooders because when a creature is big, it is unlikely to be very aggressive because otherwise they would kill each other, and Gigantopithecus' fangs were rather short, more of a chewing kind. So, if mankind evolved from Gigantopithecus, it would have been a kind mankind, which would not have had any conflicts with anyone. They were territorially from the territory of China, so they would have become such Zen Buddhists, sitting in bamboo bushes and developing philosophy. But no, the Gigantopithecines still lost to our ancestors, they took too long to swing. In Southeast Asia, the climate remained too stable for too long, and while they were busy with evolutionary Zen Buddhism, their Pithecanthropus came running from Africa with spears and Gigantopithecines disappeared. And on top of that, the climate changed, the ecosystem changed. And because they were too big, too inert, they weren't able to adapt quickly, so they got used to eating tree food, not grass. So, when the trees disappeared, the grasses appeared, and it was physically impossible for them to switch to eating grass. So, the Gigantopithecines ended. And there are, in fact, a great many such lines. For example, the lemurs in Madagascar. A completely unique ecosystem where birds, some reptiles, amphibians, and lemurs got in. Lemurs could have become humanity. But there's no danger there. There are fossas there, of course, but that's kind of insignificant compared to the leopards in Africa. Lemurs have learned to jump well, have pumped up their brains a bit compared to their ancestors, but they didn't get far. And now it is such a kind of nature reserve. And in general, some much more primitive creatures, such as reptiles and dinosaurs, could have evolved on different islands and enclosed places. If dinosaurs were isolated and not extinct on some large enough island, like Australia, then intelligent creatures could have evolved from them. But reptiles don't have a new finite brain cortex. Neither did we once have one, of course, but it did emerge. But reptiles have two good jaws. And bipedal gait in dinosaurs is not like ours. By the way, birds have the same problem. Their legs are upright and their torso is horizontal. And on a horizontal torso, if we grow a big head, it will outweigh it. Either you can have big jaws to grab prey, or you can have big brains. But if you have big brains but small jaws, you won't survive. And if you have small brains but big jaws, you won't get smart. And keeping both big brains and big jaws on a horizontal spine somehow doesn't work. And you can't grow hands that big either. And besides, egg-laying is not a good way to reproduce, because a cub of a given size will hatch, most likely already big enough. You can't raise it for a long time. Reptile's egg is too good, it's initially too well protected, and care for the offspring is especially unnecessary. Well, cobras, pythons, crocodiles have rudimentary care of offspring, but this is very little. Even amphibians have more care of offspring. By the way, birds may have become intelligent. Some birds are quite highly intelligent, especially crows, New Caledonian crows, the parrot kea. But birds need to fly. And if a bird flies, a big brain is contraindicated, it will outweigh it. And so, birds' brains are quite good in their own way. They have, for example, developed subcortical nuclei. But all of the behavior of birds comes down to instincts, which means that all of their behavior is programmed, all of their programs are written down: how to build a nest, how to raise a chick, and they also have care for their offspring. But the chick has to grow up very quickly to start flying. And the chick's childhood is usually very short, it's sometimes a couple of weeks, a couple of months at most. So it's impossible to learn anything for a long time. And plus they have double breathing, which creates problems for the emergence of live birth, which can't happen, only eggs. In order for adult birds to start breathing, they need to dry out their lungs. You can't just take them and stretch them out like in humans. Therefore, chicks can emerge only from the egg being already quite large. They grow very fast, the care of offspring is very limited, and that is where all development stops. Going back to primates again, our ancestors had other options. For example, cave dwellers. Some Homo naledi, Neanderthals, could theoretically become real gnomes. And in principle, they sometimes did become real gnomes and could have ended up in some underworld. But if a population of some creatures lives in underground chambers, somewhere underground, they'll run into a problem. There are simply too few resources. And it ends up with a shrinking brain size, a simplified body structure, degradation, and culture is lost. And no underground kingdoms with crazy architecture can be built because these inhabitants have reduced senses. As there is no danger under the ground, and there are no big predators because of the lack of food, they will have to eat some rotifers in the water, and they won't be able to filter much of them there either. Their childhood cannot be long. Of course, they can live up to 100 years, like modern amphibians Protea. Proteus can indeed live for 100 years, but in such a mode that this animal doesn't even move at all. It hangs in place, being eyeless and albino. True, its entire skin is light-sensitive, which is cool in its own way. But you can't boost intelligence in that case. Theoretically, some primates, and other creatures as well, could go back to the aquatic environment, dive deeper, and become ichthyanders. But again, there are limitations. The human brain is very energy-consuming. It expends a lot of calories, including consuming large amounts of oxygen to oxidize nutrients in the mitochondria. And if it's a fish, since it doesn't have much of a brain, it has enough gills. And if you calculate how much oxygen a human brain weighing 1.5 kilograms needs, and realize the supply of oxygen through the gills, then the gills become just a colossal size, too incongruous for a living creature. And a human being simply would not be able to move quickly. Take beavers, otters, seals, whales, and dolphins as examples. They certainly have their positives. The beaver builds dams, slaps its tail beautifully on the water. The otter is just a joyful and unkillable creature. Seals are fun too, and dolphins are even kind of smart. But they all lose their arms and legs to one degree or another. That is, they first turn into flippers. And in dolphins, the legs disappeared completely. And the arms become such rowing devices. In essence, oars and labor activity cannot be created on this basis. Of course, it is possible that there can be intelligence without labor activity. Here we see the problem in the fact that we have only had intelligence once. And we do not know 100% whether intelligence can arise without labor activity or not. We see that in our case we arose thanks to labor activity, among other things. And dolphins have a problem with that. Dolphins sometimes use some tools, too. There are recorded cases when they grab a sponge or a piece of coral and plow the bottom with it, raising the mud. Then they spin in a circle, forming a muddy ring in which they drive the fish. The fish splash there and the dolphins eat them happily, as the fish are afraid to swim through the muddy ring. So the dolphins have some rudiments of intelligence, and they can chirp in their own way. That is, they have some language of their own, and even personal names. But this is all very limited. And one should not exaggerate the intelligence of dolphins. A dolphin's main task is to outsmart a herring. And when your main task in life is to outsmart a fish, you will certainly become an intellectual, but not a very big one. So the main limitation of dolphins is that they have nothing to strive for. Maybe someday they will evolve into something, but that is highly doubtful. Then again, they have a simplified dental system, and whales have whale whiskers in general, which are not even teeth. And there is no variety of cooking for whales. They filter their broth with shrimp and that's it. And we have cookery as a good engine for our progress. So, ichthyanders might have evolved, but in the very distant future and most likely through genetic engineering. Maybe humans will create such ichthyanders themselves someday. Because both the musculoskeletal system and the arms and legs, breathing and heart have problems in this case. So basically, evolution has created many alternative pathways. Starting with invertebrates, through fish, the first amphibians, reptiles, mammals. Among mammals, there were already primate and all sorts of other creatures. But each time, there were limitations. And the only coincidence that led us to humanity has come to full fruition. That doesn't mean there can't be others. But the probability is very small. Just as there is only one species of trumpet tooth, one species of giraffe, one species of Aiurupin, and one species of Homo sapiens on the planet at the moment. And the likelihood of a second species is very slim. There have been other alternatives in history. For example, our ancestors became intelligent in no small part because they first climbed trees a lot and then came down from those trees. But in this tree climbing, they could have moved toward a strong specialization in the form of flight. The woolly-wings realized this in the form of gliding flight, and the bats, hand-wings, realized this in the form of flapping flight. And this put a big limitation on them. If bats fly the same way as birds, then even though they are already viviparous and warm-blooded, they cannot give birth to large, heavy cubs with big brains. Although man-wings live for quite a long time, 20 years each. They themselves are small, but they live a long time. They even raise their cubs, and they have social relationships. For example, when a vampire bat gets drunk on blood, which they rarely do, then it flies to its camp and shares this blood with other vampires. And they remember each other very well. If someone doesn't share blood, no one will share with him later. And if he's unlucky, he'll starve to death. So it's already such a good level of sociality. But unfortunately, bats can't have big brains. Neither can they have a long childhood, because they have to learn to fly quickly, ossify quickly, and a big head is contraindicated for them. Theoretically, based on bats, there could be intelligence if bats came down to Earth and became land creatures again. After all, there are all kinds of penguins and others. But birds become land creatures either in a very specific environment such as Antarctica, where they don't need to pump intelligence and are more concerned with surviving and fighting herrings and sea leopards. Or they emerge on islands where they simply have a paradisiacal life, like the flightless dodo or the wingless cormorant. But you don't have to get smart in those conditions. Or, like African ostriches in the African savanna, where our ancestors lived, and in the same conditions as our ancestors, but with the essential difference that our ancestor Australopithecus was 1 meter tall and everyone was trying to offend him. He had to constantly get out of his way, constantly inventing something to survive. The ostrich is 2 meters tall and has a leg that can kill anyone with a single kick. And he doesn't need to get smarter, he's fine as he is. And then again, the ostrich is egg-laying. And bats have never become terrestrial. Never in history have bats come down to Earth and become land creatures again. Not even on the islands. Maybe they haven't had enough time, maybe they're already too specialized. Their hands had already become too strange. So, theoretically it's possible, but in practice it hasn't happened yet. There are other creatures. There are, for example, elephants. Everyone knows that elephants are smart. They show tricks, they draw pictures by holding a brush with their trunk. They memorize their territory, they have leaders. The herd is usually led by the largest female. They can migrate far, digging mines to mine the earth to replenish the calcium in their organism. They have long childhood, raising their cubs for a long time. Their brains average about 4 kilograms, with a maximum of up to 9 kilograms, which is several times the human maximum. The average human brain weighs only 1,350 grams, but an elephant has 4 kilograms. And it would seem that's happiness. Why not become an intelligent creature? They also have a working organ, a trunk, with which you can pick up objects, you can move something, and so on. But an elephant is big and doesn't need anything, because predators don't attack it. There were once saber-toothed tigers, but they no longer exist. Lions once every 100 years can choke an elephant out of great hunger, but that happens very rarely. And if there are 50 elephants together, they are not afraid of anything at all. And they have no special problems in life. By the way, proboscis creatures have evolved quite rapidly over their 40 million years of existence. They become everything, short-legged, swampy, long-legged, and different. And their minds were well pumped, and their brains grew well. But they were also herbivorous. They don't have complex tasks. Their main task is to eat and drink, to fill their bellies, and that's all. So they migrate here and there, from swamp to forest. And nothing happens to them in life. So in the distant future, if elephants become smaller, more vulnerable, and a little more predatory, which is hard to believe, maybe they will become smarter. But there are also creatures that look like us, who could very well become something like us. For example, from the order of carnivores. There are humans, whose ancestors were arboreal, omnivorous, social, with grasping limbs. Take predators. They come in all kinds. Some have pretty serious limitations. For example, felines. Even if they are social cats, let's say lions, they are too specialized. And most specialized predators simply have nothing to aim for. They strangle some zebra or antelope and that's it, nothing moves on. And cats are some of the most primitive predators. Then there are the omnivores, not too specialized, but not social. These are bears. That is, bear eats the same food as humans. Lives in the same natural environment. But it is not social. That is, where people socialize, exchange, educate, bears do not socialize, and do not exchange, and do not educate. The maximum degree of interaction between bears is when they line up when salmon go to spawn, and then they jointly catch those salmon. But it's just bears being around, because there's a lot of food here at the moment, and there's not much intelligence to be gained. In general, though, the bear is pretty smart. Against the background of other animals in the forest, it is almost the smartest, because it is our ecological counterpart. By the way, the same smart animal, but not predatory, but also its ecological analog, is the pig. It's kind of a hoofed animal, but it eats everything. Pigs can even hunt roe deer. As hunters testify, judging by the tracks, sometimes boars corral roe deer, strangle them, tear them apart, and eat them. So, they are just as omnivorous and are our full ecological counterparts. It's not without reason that piglets' teeth resemble human teeth and are almost indistinguishable. But pigs have specialized hands and feet because they have hooves, because they are ungulates. And they can't do tools. That is, they can train their brains. They are really smart compared to other ungulates, cows and sheep, for instance. But they are terrestrial, specialized diggers. Returning to predators, there are other options. The most obvious is canines. Dogs are smart, so what's next? And the wolf is even smarter. Against his background, dogs look stupid. But it is again the ecological analog of man. It eats everything, lives anywhere, social, lives in society, raises offspring, learns, can partially use tools. There was a wonderful story in the Caucasus. A group of wolves found a stake sticking out of the forest and drove moose onto the stake. Somehow, they chased moose along the trail so the moose would run into the stake. And then this stake rotted away and wolves became confused. What should we do? How should we catch moose? And this group of wolves partly died out and partly scattered in different directions. But wolves have a limitation. They are strictly terrestrial. They were arboreal back in the Eocene epoch, about 40 million years ago, and they have two specialized arms and legs. They can only run, and this scrawny foot with little claws can't pick up and hold anything. And, again, instrumental activity is impossible. To fetch slippers or balls, that's all right. But that's when a human needs it. That's why dogs are stupider than wolves. Because wolves, compared to dogs, solve their problems and think with their heads, but dogs think with the human head and follow the commands of man. So, dogs are no doubt smart, but the smartest dogs are huskies, which are as close to their natural environment as possible, and they solve their problems. They can be unfed, they can be kept off leash. The most obvious parameter to understand if a dog is smart or not is to let him off the leash. A smart dog will stay near the person, a stupid dog will run away and you will never find it. Smart dog will not get lost. Leica lives with hunters in the woods, runs freely, does not know what a leash is, and never gets lost. It solves its problems and lives quite independently. But its hands and feet are specialized. So, dogs have this limitation and evolution does not go any further. Finally, among carnivores, there are their primate analogs. These are the raccoons. They are, at least in part, arboreal, omnivorous, social, with a selection strategy where the species survives through high individuality rather than multiplicity of offspring. Our ancestors had it the same way. If you take the primates of the Paleocene and Eocene, it's almost like a raccoon. They seem to have everything, and it already seems that the raccoon could have made a reasonable man. They also have a lot of diversity. They live on land, in water, and anywhere. But they don't. And paradoxically, the oldest raccoons, for example, in South America, they belong to the same genus as modern raccoons. And for at least 20 million years, they haven't moved anywhere. That is, our ancestors for those 20 million years have moved from proconsul to human, while raccoons have been frozen at the level of the genus, and as they were raccoons, so they have remained raccoons. Maybe it was the overdeveloped sense of smell and the lack of grip of the hand that created the problem. No matter how dexterous their fingers are, they can open locks, for example. Read Gerald Durrell, he has wonderful descriptions of what raccoons do. And you can watch modern videos on the subject. But still, it's not a grasping hand like ours. They have big claws and they cling to branches with them rather than grip them. With us, this kind of grasping on branches was a pre-adaptation for instrumental activity, for opposing the thumb, for grasping some objects, and raccoons didn't have this kind of moment. But it is solvable, because our ancestors also didn't have it in the Paleocene, but then it appeared. But our ancestors were such specialized arboreal jumpers, and so pretty much lost their sense of smell and developed good eyesight and, to some extent, hearing. The development of hearing was a pre-adaptation for the emergence of speech. And raccoons, they're climbers, they don't jump. They can't jump far. They have short, fat legs and no jumping joint like we do. True, humans lost that too, but not until later, when they got down on the ground. And our ancestors were jumping on branches. Jumping on branches allowed us to develop coordination of movements, quick thinking, to calculate if I needed to get on this branch and not the next one, because I would not fall from this one, and this one I might fall from. And safety from predators as well. And raccoons, they climb trees, they don't jump far. So, they slow down a little bit. If you look at how monkeys and raccoons behave, you see that raccoons are frankly slacking off. They take a long time to think. Compared to cats, though, they're pretty quick. But they're not fidgety, they're not hustling. And as social as they are, they're all about their sense of smell. That's why they have a big nose, like Nasua, for example, and they are almost like monkeys, even look very similar. And they seem to live in groups. But with them, it's all about the sense of smell. And for us, it's all about sight. In principle, probably, evolution could produce an intelligent being with a highly developed sense of smell. But still, it is much more convenient and possible to convey information by means of gestures and sounds than by means of smells. How can you smell so that you can find the integral? But to draw or sound an integral is quite possible. It is clear that Australopithecines did not solve integrals yet, but they had their own tasks. For example, how to transfer information to make a stone tool. They could show and voice it. And one can clearly imagine what were the first words when the ancient people hit themselves with a stone on the finger. But it is difficult to depict with the help of smell how to make a stone axe. So, this adherence to tree crawling, claws instead of grasping fingers with nails, and a tendency to smell instead of sight and hearing were the obstacles that prevented raccoons from developing further. And let's take primates that are as similar to us as possible. The same capuchins we already mentioned, or chimpanzees, which are our closest relatives. If anyone is to evolve further, it's them. Or gibbons, for example. They, too, are kind and good. True, they have an overly specialized hand, but still. They, too, can evolve. True, in practice we see that they evolve in other directions. Chimpanzees, for example, have evolved the complex of walking on bent fingers. And it is already quite difficult to make a working hand out of such a hand. Their teeth have grown quite noticeably. They used to be smaller, but then they got bigger. And also, they can get kinder. Pygmy chimpanzees, for example, are quite kind, but our ancestors were kinder. So there are plenty of chances for life on Earth. And we haven't touched the masses of other living things yet. But the main problem for all these candidates for intelligence is that there is already man on the planet. And man is such a super competitor, so cool and powerful, who has occupied every possible ecological niche, that it's almost impossible to get past him. Because an intelligent being has to be energy intensive to supply a lot of energy to his brain. It has to be pretty big, take up a lot of space. It eats a lot, it has to live somewhere. And humans take up all the space. There's a lot of fiction writers on this subject. But they're pretty poor in imagination. Because when they write about alternative creatures like gnomes, elves, and so on, they take humans as the basis. Slimmer, more subdued, with pointed ears, pognatee, balder, well, what is it? But intelligent raccoons, that's it. That's more or less real. Or acanthids, the same centaur, but not based on a hoofed animal. You can't make a centaur out of a hoofed animal, but based on a fish. Now that would be cool. And maybe in some distant future something of this will be realized. There is a simple pattern in evolution that all the most advanced, the coolest and most progressive arises from the most squalid and primitive. Because if someone is already steep enough, specialized and developed, he usually won't go any further. He reaches his peak, he is perfectly adapted to that environment, he has no one to jump over. He has succeeded in everything in his life. And all specialized creatures stop there. And the uniqueness of the same man is that all of his ancestors were nothing. They were very average and inarticulate. He was uncomfortable all the time. He always had to overcome some problems and evolve. And there are creatures much more peculiar, like the platypus. It has a huge snout, it lays eggs, it has electroreception, it has a poisonous claw on its leg. It is covered with fur and can secrete milk, though it has no mammary glands. But it is too specialized for swimming, for eating crayfish, for electroreception, as a consequence of which its eyes are not very good, no teeth. And you can't make a platypus into anything but a platypus. At most, you can make an echidna. If you take a platypus out onto dry land and it grows needles, you get an echidna. But this, too, is the end of evolution. Nothing can be made further. You can't make anything from an anteater either, because it has no teeth. We also lose things from time to time. We lost our tail, our vibrissae, our teeth are also getting smaller and smaller in numbers, and we've lost a lot. Our sense of smell is quite bad, we have almost no fur left. We have already lost many of the abilities that could have been the groundwork for some new evolutionary achievements.